Welcome to the Ideation podcast. This is an on-the-go podcast designed to help you move your ideas forward through better implementation. In each episode, we'll hear from thought leaders in multiple industries, share about how they implement their ideas in order to make them remarkable. That is worth making a remark about. I'm your host, Charles Lee. Everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to the Ideation webinar with my good friend, Chris Schwartz. In a moment, I'll give an intro to him, but I wanted to give you some instructions for those of you who are joining us via the webinar, is that you'll see on the bottom of your screen a chat function as well as a question and answer function. So we'll get to some of your questions throughout this next hour as Chris shares insights, and I'll grab some of those questions while he's talking and make sure I get it to him as well. I think most of you are here and many of you have already heard of Chris. He is the founding partner at Gravity, a center for contemplative activism. Gravity exists to support the development of consciousness by offering contemplative retreats, spiritual direction, and Innergram consultations and workshops. Chris spent nearly 3 decades in community organizing, international humanitarian work, and anti-trafficking efforts, and was first introduced to Innergram in the slums of Cambodia, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. Since then, he has trained under some of the great living Enneagram masters and now teaches the Enneagram in workshops around the world as an International Enneagram Association accredited professional. He's the host of the Enneagram Mapmakers podcast and is also featured in a new up-and-coming documentary that is scheduled to release this fall called 9, the Innergram documentary, A Journey Across America to introduce the essence of the 9 profile types. He is the author of 7 books, including the award-winning bestseller, The Sacred Enneagram, and his latest book that is actually launching officially today is called The Innergram of Belonging. Both are compassionate guides for those who want to incorporate personal growth and development in their Enneagram type. That was a mouthful, Chris. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming on. It's always good to see you, friend.
Yeah, great to see you, Charles. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about in relationship to Innergram. For me personally, this has been a very helpful tool and practice in my life personally, as well as even in our clients' lives as well. And so I wanted to kind of start because I don't think I've ever heard like the full story of your first introduction to the Innergram in Cambodia. Tell us a little bit of what's kind of like the backstory of your first kind of inroads into the Innergram.
Yeah. So it's hard to believe, like when you were reading all that, it's like I actually joined a humanitarian organization back in 1993, and I'm like, I'm seriously that old? Good Lord. But this has been about 20 years in humanitarian work. And we were primarily focusing in parts of South and Southeast Asia, was visiting some of the projects there in India and Nepal and Thailand. And on my way home, decided to visit some friends in Phnom Penh. So we stopped to say hi. This guy I was a student with in university. And he introduced us to a couple of his dear friends. It was a Cambodian woman who was a refugee, a survivor of the Khmer Rouge genocide, who ended up in New Zealand, grew up there, met a man, they got married and moved back to Cambodia. So we're having lunch on this rooftop cafe, sitting on these pillows, and they asked Felina, my wife and I, hey, have you guys ever heard of the Enneagram? And we're like, no, what's that? And as he began to unpack it, I was like, there's no way that like humanity could be reduced down to just 9 kinds of people. And so I was fighting, pushing. Yeah. But man, it made sense. We flew back to the States. I was actually in Long Beach, crashed at a buddy's house, jet lagged out of my mind, and got online. Back in 2000, hardly any online tests, but I found as many as I could. Took them all, put the results in a spreadsheet, sent it back to my buddy in Cambodia, and I said, hey, am I getting close to finding my type? And he was just like, mate, you're doing this completely wrong. And what he did then was ask me a question about how I related to my mother, because he knew my type. I think it was pretty obvious to him. And what he was doing was he was holding up one of the so-called childhood wounds of the type that he thought I was. And it knocked the breath out of me. I just thought, is it this obvious to everybody but me? And so at that point, I was sold.
Mm. So when we talk about the Enneagram, I'm sure many on this webinar and listening may be familiar, but just for the sake of those who may be unfamiliar, tell us a little bit about what the Enneagram is and what distinguishes it from other types of quote unquote personality tests.
Yeah. So what the Enneagram has become in 2020 is actually a kind of map of, let's say, the 9 archetypes for human character structure. And that's a really simple way to say it, because like actually you can kind of keep twisting the lens on this, and it really does end up showing you 108 types. But the Enneagram of personality really, and what I like to say is it shows our ego set of coping addictions that we've wrapped up around a childhood wound so that we don't have to tell ourselves the truth about who we really are.
Mm.
And what it does, and how it's, let's say, different from something like the Myers-Briggs or the Strengths Finders, is that it sort of exposes our ego structure and what we do to contend with the pain of being human. What we do with trying to, let's say, map the contours of our ego structure is build personality around that as a defense mechanism of not having to come home to our truest self. So I think that's what the Enneagram offers us. I like to say this, that it's kind of a compassionate sketch of possibilities for who we can become when we remember what our essence was or what we've lost contact with.
That's a great way of putting it. So when you think about that, and I know a little bit later we'll talk a little bit about childhood wounds and such, but you know, I think you're the one who wrote like the Enneagram may be the most effective tool for personal liberation, but it sounds like it takes a lot of courage to get to the place where you walk down this path. Tell us a little bit about what that is that you're referring to.
Well, so here's the deal. Like, a lot of us have spent really our entire lives sort of curating and perfecting and polishing personality, and this is what we project. It's really the projection, let's say, of our own ego mythology of how we want to understand ourselves, how we want to be seen, and we come to believe that that's true. So I also try to say this, that most of us don't know that we don't know who we are, and that's kind of a painful wake-up call, because if I actually believe that I'm my personality, if I actually believe my identity has been sort of co-opted by any one of the fragments that have attempted to lay hold to who I think I am, then there's a kind of recovery here. And that, for some of us, that requires a deconstructing of the scaffolding, of the mythology, of the personality. So for me, it's been painful. It was painful in my old humanitarian work. I over-identified with my role, with my job, with my efforts in the world, all the while forgetting myself. And so when something like the Enneagram shows up, it can be compassionate. It can be a kind of gentle spotter to just say, no, let's remember who you really are. And it's not what you do, the good or the bad. It's not how you present in the world for the good or the bad. There's a gift somewhere in there. And for my Enneagram type, that gift is innocence, and that gift is truth. And to return to that innocence and to return to that truth, it can be humiliating, because the ego wants to defend ourselves from that innocence, and the ego wants to tell lies against that truth. But in the end, it's ultimately freeing.
Yeah, so this notion of our true self versus a false version of ourselves, you use a pretty fun analogy that is, I think, really insightful, and that's actually the Wizard of Oz. And tell us a little bit about that analogy of why you think that paints a, at least a fair picture of what we tend to do.
Yeah. So so in the Enneagram, let's say that one of the first ways of kind of starting to understand how it sort of helps us is it shows us our primary mode of perceiving and processing the world. And that's through what are called the centers of intelligence. And so that's our body center, or our instincts, or intuition, our heart center, which is our feelings or emotions, and our head center, which is our thoughts, or sort of what we do to analyze and suss and forecast out. So we have all of these, of course, these 3 centers at play: our intuition, our feelings, and our thoughts. And we have a kind of bias, let's say, towards one of those. Well, I love to bring those into the Wizard of Oz, because if you remember the story, right, this little girl gets knocked out cold in Kansas. Everything's in black and white until she wakes up into this dream, and now it's magical, and it's in color, and it's ridiculous, and it's playful. everything tastes like candy and everybody has a song, and it could be an amazing sort of fantasy to live in, but soon she gets tired and she wants to go home. So that's really first for me, like what the Enneagram is all about, coming home to our truest self, like returning back to our essence. Well, before she can get home, she has to sort of make this pilgrimage, and she meets three folks along the way, right? The lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow. And if you take a Jungian dream analysis overlay to Oz, it suddenly starts to make sense. And the Jungian dream analysis sort of baseline is this: everybody who shows up in your dream is part of your disconnected subconscious, messaging something to you while you're asleep that you won't listen to while you're awake. Mm. So everybody in your dream, it's you. And so we can take that into Oz, and yep, these three people that Dorothy meets on the road, it's just her. It's her disconnected centers of intelligence. It's a lion who's disconnected from its body, the Tin Man who's disconnected from its heart, and the Scarecrow who's disconnected from its mind. And what Dorothy has to help these folks realize is you've always had everything that you've needed. And when she can help them integrate with the truth of who they were, she wakes up. And that's what we're trying to do here, wake up. And I think we do that through integrating the whole, every aspect of ourself.
That's a great analogy. So I know there within like Enneagram circles and conversations, there's almost like a debate whether or not our type is nature or innate, or whether it is the result of our circumstances. And I think you have a unique approach in navigating that conversation. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on, is this nature or nurture, circumstance, or predetermined? Like what's going on?
Yeah. So one of my teachers, Father Richard Rohr, will say that it's 1/3 nature, 1/3 nurture, and 1/3 us playing a role. And I can see that, I guess. My sense is this: I'm lazy when I say you're born your type, but I mean a version of that, because what I really believe is each of us are born purpose to help heal the world, to bring a gift into realigning what's off in the world. The problem is we lose contact with that gift. And in losing contact with that gift, we have to make sense of it, because there's a kind of suffering in the loss of innocence, and the loss of hope, and the loss of courage or faith or love. So when we look back on our early holding environments, all of our imperfect childhoods, we kind of narrate this as a childhood wound. And that's what the Enneagram says here, that there is a childhood wound that is the evidence of what was lost, that disconnect from essence. Now, my sense is this: we're not born our type, we're born our essence. When we lose contact with that essence and begin to suffer, type is the inevitable way of coping with that suffering. And it shows up in predictable and patterned ways. And so I've tried to do a lot to rehabilitate the language of the childhood wounds. And it's important to me, because that's actually how I feel like the Enneagram found me, through the so-called childhood wounds. That's where it was the most obvious to me. But I look at someone like you and Tina, and it's like, man, you're incredible parents. And like, you didn't wound your kids, and you didn't wound your kids into type. Like, you did your best. And like all of us, there was just going to be the inevitability of, it's hard to be human, and it's not safe to have hope, or to be innocent, or to always feel like I can be vulnerable. So in my new book, I actually rewrite all of the Enneagram so-called childhood wounds as our kid life crisis, the sort of painful welcoming into our shared human condition.
Oh, that's good. So in your book, your new book that just came out, you write that self-awareness is one thing, but radical self-acceptance is what we really need to for transformed living. Tell us a little bit about that challenge of self-acceptance, because I think in one aspect, it's kind of nice to do lots of different types of assessment. I kind of enjoy it, because I want to be self-aware. But I think really getting to that place of like what you call radical self-acceptance is not easy. And so unpack that for us a little bit of that challenge. How do you think about that? How do you frame that?
Yeah. So it's hard. It's hard for me, if I'm honest. It's like, I grew up, I was raised Catholic, then my parents became Protestant, and both like Catholic and Protestant, like let's say elementary and middle schools, my religious socialization included this idea that I was somehow, and we all are as humans, somehow fundamentally flawed, and there's nothing we can do to sort of save ourselves from that. In fact, there's kind of this impending punishment for simply just being born human. And in that religious socialization for me, it was really hard for me growing up to actually accept what was good in me, what was beautiful in me. Like I always kind of had to say, no, there's nothing really good in me because of this kind of religious environment. Now, on the other hand, there's also been parts of my life where it's like I made regrettable decisions, like I wasn't caring for myself or my community or my partner in the way that I wanted to. And sometimes I over-identify with my failures or mistakes or greatest regrets. And so somewhere in between all of that, I've actually suffered this sort of fragmentation of myself where it's like, I don't want to accept what's good about me. And it's really hard for me to accept my mistakes in the past. But I think when you start to work with something like the Innergram, what you get to do here is you get to bring it all together and you get to make space for all of it. And you let all of it belong with compassion. And you accept that, you know, like my teacher, Father Richard Rohr, says, to cast a great light in the world simultaneously means we cast a long shadow. It all belongs. It's hard work because you see this, like when you there's a certain kind of person, when you compliment, they just can't receive it. They deflect it. They won't let it belong. And there's a certain kind of person when you actually have to call them out on, hey, you could have handled yourself better. They defend themselves. They won't let that belong. But you see, this is what it simply means to be human, that we're neither good nor bad, that we just are, by the virtue of our humanity, perfectly us, and we have to align with that. And so this is the hard work. And if we don't, for me, it's when I don't bring compassion into it, I make it harder for myself. Yeah. And so it has to be gentle work. We have to find a sense of humor about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find that it's definitely easier sometimes to be compassionate about other people and to try to achieve some level of empathy than it is to be compassionate about myself. And you know, that is a constant battle. And I think that's why, like in your new book, you talk about finding the courage to face our shadows. And I mean, what is that? Because at a very high level, it feels like that's a road to health. Is it just our, you know, maybe distaste or lack of desire to go and address things that are in the shadows? Or what is it about us that, you know, we find struggle in when it comes to facing our shadows?
Yeah. So when I talk about the shadow, I'm not talking about, you know, our false self, or if like in my former religious upbringing, like a so-called sinful nature. Like I'm really just talking about what's behind my conscious awareness. And so this is where most of us park things that we don't want to contend with, that we don't want to deal with. And that can be both good and bad. I do think it does take courage to sort of enter the shadow and to interrogate and to be reintroduced to what we've parked back there. Because on a subconscious level, we've put it there for a reason. And that reason is maybe we're not ready to ingest, metabolize, incorporate every aspect into the whole of who we are. And in the Innergram of belonging, I play around with the notion of a shadow. And I metaphor, of course, against a cave, which is, you know, classic in all mythology and literature and story. And sort of remind us that, like, in every great story, and so I just use Pixar and Star Wars and Disney, like Moana and Coco and Inside Out, to sort of highlight the shadows in those stories and shows what happens when those characters enter the cave and what's rediscovered and reclaimed. And it's almost always beautiful. It's almost always hopeful. It's almost always healing in every instance. And so it's ironic that we don't want to go to the very place where we will be made whole. And I think that's why it takes courage.
You know, you talk a lot about childhood wounds. Unpack that for us and why it's so important to reimagine it with compassion.
Yeah. So I like I said, I don't love that childhood wounding language, because it assumes blame. Like it assumes that my folks or your folks or you and Tina are wounding the tenderest parts of your children. And I really believe this. I really believe that in almost every instance of every parent I've ever come across, they're doing their best. And I also want to say this: memories look, eyewitness testimony is often unreliable in courts because memories are in a sense metaphors that we have to pack with meaning so that our stories make sense. Okay, so you and I could remember when we first met completely different. We could remember the environment, the event, like the other people around completely different because it has to add up to something in our story of becoming.
Mm.
But I think this idea of wounding maybe misses the point. So yes, a lot of us experience real wounds in our childhood. And I don't think that those real wounds created type. I think we brought type to make sense of the pain of those wounds. And I think what we were sensitive about, and I think what was triggering maybe in some of us, and I think what we reacted to was, and I use this language, like the confirmation bias of what was lost, the confirmation bias of being disconnected from our essence. And so when we can, let's say, like I said earlier, maybe rehabilitate this languaging around so-called childhood wounds, actually one of the things that happens is it helps us heal some of the broken relationships with a parent or a caregiver. It actually helps us find grace for, they probably were doing their best. And when I was 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, I did not have the psychological sophistication to actually narrate the reality of my environment.
Yeah.
And in that healing, it just tumbles forward because when I'm healed and you and I are healed, we help heal the world, right?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think from even the one who potentially could, I feel like there are plenty of times, even as a parent, where, yeah, a part of me wants to say I'm doing my best. The reality is sometimes when I see the outcome of my actions toward my kids, I can see whether it's in some of their habits or behavior or their responses and things like that. I probably had a contributing factor to things, some of their characters that they don't even self-identify as possibly being like negative in their eyes. So I think it's like seeing the Enneagram has helped to kind of see it from like both sides of the fence. And I think, like you said, if you can somehow frame it in compassion, it's been very helpful to think about those types of situations. Because I think about my own parents, and there were times where I felt very wounded, quote unquote, wounded by them. And looking back, the older I get, obviously, like you mentioned, like I feel like I have more context and I can understand why they split. And so several other things that were kind of the domino effects of some of the choices they made in life for our family. So, I think that word compassion is something that I know I've always seen that in your life over the years, even prior to your engagement of the Enneagram. I remember all the work you did overseas and practicing compassion towards our type. This seems to be kind of key. So when you talk about compassion, what does compassion look like to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, you had mentioned this earlier, like it's sometimes easier to have compassion for someone else. Yeah. And I'll say that, like the 20 years of international humanitarian work I did, I loved it. I love the community. I love the projects. Most of those are still going on today. But it was easier actually to have compassion for folks who've been trafficked into the commercial sex industry or conscripted of little kids to fight in civil wars or youth living on the sewers or streets and refugee camps. And I hate to say this, I think sometimes when I reflect back on that, it seems like there might have been part of me that was projecting outside of myself what I wasn't really able to do inside myself. And yes, like the compassion I could extend to the women and kids and the youth we're working with was a bridge back to finding compassion for myself. But that was really hard work. It still is really hard work for me. And so right now it just means embracing my humanity, being as patient and kind and accepting of myself as I was with folks who had been marginalized or were vulnerable, and then simultaneously realizing, man, was I actually trying to fix outside of myself what I didn't want to fix inside myself? And rather than beating myself up for that now, and rather than sort of judging myself for that, it's just like, no, Blake, I really thought I was doing my best, and I hope I still really am doing my best. And that's all we can do is be our best. And what the Innergram shows us, and this is great because one of the foundational components of type structure is that we all have a virtue, right? And this is part of this component of our essence. Well, virtue, the Latin word vir that we get virtue out of from in English, simply, and vir in Latin doesn't mean moral or integrous or perfect or virtuous as we would assume it. It means human. And so to be virtuous just means to be human. And I think that's what compassion looks like. It just means I can return to working with the good and the bad of my humanity, and that's okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's good.
yeah.
Well, we have a couple of questions that are coming in. One is the question of how important is it to have a partner or mentor in the process of working the Innergram?
Man, that's a great question, because in the old days, like, so the Enneagram of personality is really just a 50-year-old tradition, right? 1971, 72, and 73, a Chilean Gestalt psychoanalyst was developing Enneagram types. When he was doing this, he was working with Berkeley students, and he made all of them sign a contract of reserve, which said, I won't share this with anyone until I've done my own work. So on one hand, I get it. Like when I first learned this, I wanted to type everybody, right?
Yeah.
But there is something about working with and on yourself and really incorporating this N-word. And so I would say that that's where you're going to find the most credibility in reflecting and working with the tool, is taking it inward. Because just like all of our mentors, they can only take us as far as they've gone themselves. But I'd also say, yes, like to meet with an Enneagram one-on-one coach or specialist, to meet with a spiritual director, to meet with a therapist, like to have somebody in conversation, I think really helps, because there's lots of parts of ourselves that we won't see honestly. There's lots of parts of ourselves that we've defended against, and sometimes we need some objectivity to just sort of call it out and to help point it out. And that requires somebody that is skilled, that is compassionate, and that we can trust, somebody who's also done their own work. So when you can find someone, I think it just helps take it all the deeper. And actually through our little nonprofit Gravity, we have kind of a brokerage. We have a half a dozen Enneagram specialists who've been trained and certified, who do one-on-one work with people.
So I want to dive a little bit into, like you've mentioned, virtues in the context of the Enneagram. There are also passions. And, I think one of the chapters in the new book, you talk about making peace with our passions. Explain that for us.
Yeah. So the passions, let's say in the 70s and 80s, when the Jesuits kind of got a hold of the Enneagram of personality and let it leak, they kind of let it, Claudio said it sort of hit the streets too soon. They kind of, I joke around, it's like they kind of rubbed some Bible on it and wrapped the 7 deadly sins plus 2, so now the 9 capital sins around the Enneagram as the passions. And I think, 20 years ago when I came across this, people were kind of shamed into type based on a so-called sin tendency or the shape of their tragic flaw as reflected through their Enneagram type's passion. And that's a pretty effective way to find type, actually, but I think it actually lacks compassion. I think sort of shaming somebody into something probably will always backfire. So, and some of the work I've been doing over the years, I've actually tried to, let's say, reframe these passions not as sin, but as our subconscious's most honest sort of cry. Like, I have lost contact with my innocence, and I so badly want to get back there, and my heart is aching to return to that. Right? And how does my heart ache? Well, we see it ache in 9 different ways. And so it's like a baby crying. There's nothing wrong with a child crying. In fact, the child crying alerts us to something. Something's off, something's wrong, something's missing. We have to tend to this. The problem is we let's say overutilize these passions. And then when we overutilize them, they become and can become addictive, and they can become unhelpful habitual patternings that actually don't help us get home to our true self, but in fact fortify the stuckness of sort of living in our illusion. So I try to rewrite the passions. For the 9, they say the passion is sloth or laziness, and you hear this all the time when people are teaching the passions. Well, it's not really sloth or laziness, it's more self-forgetting. And it's like, well, if it's more self-forgetting, then let's actually find language that sort of explains why. Why do nines self-forget? And and could we actually sort of not use laziness or sloth to shame nines into waking up, but maybe say, you know what, nines kind of carry a numbness in their head, like, I'm so tired of mediating everything for everyone else and holding the world in a place of peace. At the end of the day, I just have to flip a switch. And yes, it might look like laziness to you, but it's how I cope with how I help heal the world. And suddenly now, getting a little bit closer to what that might mean for nine. And so I do that. I reframe the passions as a carnal hunger we carry in our bodies, as an emotional ache that we suffer in our hearts, and as an existential restlessness that we try to make sense of in our minds.
All right, that's good. We also have someone here asking, how do you differentiate between true self and quote unquote personality?
Yeah, it's a great question, because for a lot of us, I mean, let me just always try to say, like, for me, I thought my personality was the truest part of myself. And I especially thought some of the work that I was doing, that my humanitarian work, was aligned with my truest self, and that was me. I think what the Innergram shows us is that if you can find your type's holy idea and your type's virtue, it starts to give you hints, kind of some of the ingredients of the cocktail of your essence. And in 9 ways, you see the interaction of these things sort of play out. And I think you see this in the most innocent version of yourself. So I think your essence is your soul's creative purpose for being. I think it's the truest lullaby in your inner child's heart that tells you that it's okay to be you, that you are beautiful, that you are fabulous, that it's not bragging if it's true. So live into that. And it shows you how, like I said earlier, like how you carry a piece of this puzzle that helps heal the world. And I think to align with that is to really become the best kind of human that we were meant to be.
That's good. Well, those of you who are listening to this webinar, make sure you go ahead and ask your questions. Before we get into the questions, is also thinking in terms of, like, I know some are joining this webinar from the vantage point of vocation, working with teams, and you've led teams, and it's one thing to just say, hey, you're a 5, you're a 3, you're a 7, but that compassion element, what advice would you give to quote unquote people who are supervisors or those who are leaders of teams, is that if you are going to engage your team in this, here's some things you should consider if you're going to engage in the Innergram?
Yeah, so a few of my teachers have done a lot of sort of corporate work, corporate coaching, management, and that kind of overlay here. And I think that's usually most effective, like I said, when the person who's kind of facilitating or guiding, managing, or leading has done their own work, who can be vulnerable with that, who can sort of show through the example of, hey, this is where it's kind of arrested me, and this is where it's freed me. I think if you're going to bring this into some corporate settings, like you'll have to kind of use, you might have to relanguage some things, because like when you start to talk about the instincts, there's a self-preservation, a sexual and a social instinct. And like, I kind of joke around, like, you kind of never want to say, like, if your boss is a sexual 9, like that kind of gets weird, because you're thinking actually he's more of a perverted 2. But I think there's ways that it can be helpful. And I think where it's most helpful in some of these organizational settings is when you start to bring in communication styles, when you start to bring in how types are misunderstood, let's say in communities, where you bring in the conflict avoidance styles, conflict resolution styles. And I think that stuff gets super practical, but it requires a little bit of self-awareness, and it requires a little bit of like being honest with, yep, this is what I'm doing. That's the pattern. Like I can see it coming.
Yeah, you did. I bought a couple of books that you recommended several months back on kind of the workplace, and it's right. Those books did kind of reframe the language of it, which was really helpful. They dove into leadership styles, to conflict resolution, and we found, like, even in some of our clients, that sometimes just knowing when someone's at a stress point or functioning in some spectrum of stress, was really practical in resolving misunderstanding. I know some of the leaders that we've worked with appreciate the fact that it allows you to stop making this personal with other team members. It created language and space for them to actually work towards something together. So those were a lot of the benefits. We have a couple other questions coming in. It says here, my husband is struggling with landing on his number. He flows between a 2 and a 3 very easily. Any advice on some key questions to ask to help identify his type?
So yeah, so if you know the basics of the Enneagram, you realize this is kind of a color wheel, let's say, that the numbers blend into each other. And so that space between 2 and 3 can really sort of become one of these sort of like empty spaces that fuses these two types together. And so your partner's a 2 with a 3 wing or a 3 with a 2 wing, there will be a lot of similarities. The difference here is the 3s kind of suffer this ache that they do not have intrinsic value other than what they sort of earn. And you see, for poor 3s, this breaks my heart. You know, they're sometimes called the achiever. It's not about achieving success. It's never been about success or failure for the 3. It's always been about value. And as little kids, 3s, and 3s generally in the Enneagram kind of have the emptiest of the heart centers. As little kids, they wanted to fill that emptiness. And then very quickly they realized, I can fill that with kind of these hits of recognition, affirmation, attention, reward. But you see, what happened was they began to make a trade, and they allowed these to be a proxy or a substitute for love, and it was never satisfying, so it became addictive. And that's why 3s look so driven. It's simply they're trying to chase down the love that they want the most efficient way that they think they can, but because it's not love, it never fills that void, and so the chase is endless. Now, for the 2s, the difference here is, the fear isn't I don't have value and so I'm not lovable. The fear is I'm born to be a source of love, and so I have to actually love everybody else in the world better than I love myself. And this is where that embrace, that nurturing embrace of the 2 comes forward. The fear here is that they're simply loveless, even though they love the idea of love, and they love everyone so well. And so if you look at that basic fear of being disconnected from love or not having intrinsic value, that's one of the ways of getting there.
That's helpful. A few more questions here. One person asks, I would be interested in knowing where I can read more about reframing the sins of all the Enneagram. Is this located in a book you would recommend?
So actually, that's what I just, well, I actually have a whole chapter in this new book where
Great.
I actually give 27 new labels for these passions. And like I said, I don't think they're sin. I mean, for type 2, right? It's historically and traditionally, this is the language of Oscar Chasso, been called, the passion has been called pride. And it's like, 2s aren't arrogant. And so what I do here for the 2 is I say, let's reframe what pride is for the 2 by saying, you know what it really is in their bodies is denial. I'm going to deny what I want. I'm going to deny what I need, because that's loving. And you see, when you deny even what you want and need, yes, there can be kind of a self-sabotaging false humility in there that looks like pride. Well, those 2s take that denial of what they want in their bodies into their heart as kind of presumption. And the presumption of the 2 is this: I know how to love you. Why don't you know how to love me? I know exactly what you need. Why don't you know what I need? Or I'm here to serve you. Couldn't you just figure out how to help me for once? And that presumption comes up in 2s. You hear 2s say things like, I thought you knew I wanted to go see that film, or I thought you knew I'd love to have dinner with those people. The presumption is, because I'm so good at this, you should also be so good at it. And so that can kind of be a kind of pride.
Yeah.
But then the 2s take that into their head as self-abnegation. And self-abnegation is giving yourself away at your own expense and then convincing yourself that that's loving. And that's the classic story of the giving tree. She lets the boy take the fruit and she tells herself she's happy. She lets the boy cut her limbs down. She tells herself she's happy. She lets the boy cut her trunk down and she tells herself she's happy. And she's convincing herself all the while that if I give of myself, this is what makes me happy. When in fact, no, you're being destroyed, and you're allowing yourself to be destroyed. And there's no love in that, because if you can't love yourself, you can't love us. And so we reframe all of these in the new book.
Along the lines of like finding which type, anonymous attendee said, I score as a 4, 9, and 1, almost exactly the same scores. Are there questions I can reflect on to determine which is primary and a wing?
Yeah. So, there would be a few reasons why this would happen. The 4s and 9s are both what are considered withdrawn or detached social styles. The 9s withdraw in relationship to maintain a sense of autonomy. The 4s withdraw because the 4s have this abandonment narrative that they're just going to be abandoned by everyone. And so when they withdraw, it's a test. And if I don't move towards you, then I also get in line with everybody who's abandoned the 4. Subconscious, we don't know this is happening. The 4 and the 1 would sometimes mistype because these are flow types with their energy. 1s and 4s are frustrated idealists. The difference here is 1s are frustrated about their idealization of what's good and perfect in the world and how they'll never live up to it. 4s idealize beauty and significance, but feel as if they're never going to align with it. And then that 9 and 1 connection would sometimes make sense because both the 9 and the 1 are in their bodies. They both have that fundamental social need for autonomy. They both have that most accessible emotion of frustration or anger. But I would just sort of play with that. If you sort of land in 3 of those, like try to figure out, like, do you think you're in your body? Do you think you're in your heart? Because those are really different centers. And the body types, 8, 9, and 1, show up very differently than the heart types, 2, 3, and 4. And then I think once you kind of find your center, it gets a little bit easier to sort of locate type.
That's insightful. We have an interesting comment and question here from Liz. There are those who talk about the Innergram as a dance, a movement. I came upon the Innergram maybe 4 years ago. I am 74, and this view resonates with my view of moving around the Innergram. Would you speak to that movement?
Yeah. So what I love about the Enneagram, in the old days, I used to hear it called a psycho-spiritual character structure tool. And that psycho-spiritual sort of brackets or framework was because it was a Chilean Gestalt psychoanalyst that framed Enneagram types around psychological descriptions. And then it was the Jesuits that leaked it into the world, spiritual. So psycho-spiritual were the brackets. The bummer is it's also a somatic tool and a somatic teaching. And so a little over 100 years ago, a Russian Armenian mystic, George Gurdjieff, brought the Enneagram forward. When George Gurdjieff brought the Enneagram forward, he didn't teach it as personalities. He taught it as a way of translating any perfect system. He said, if you drew the Enneagram in the sands of a desert over and over again, you could see into everything that's been taught and everything that could be learned. And when Gurdjieff taught the Enneagram, he only taught it through dance and through body work. And so I do think there's an urgent need for folks who are healers, who do somatic work and body work to help us bring this wisdom back into our bodies. And you see this mapped against the symbol. There's all these crisscrossing lines. And Gurdjieff said, if the Enneagram isn't in perpetual motion, then we're not working with the Enneagram. It's dynamic, it's in movement. And so, yes, to follow those lines along our egoic structure, to follow those lines actually tells us a completely different story. And these lines in the middle, in my new book, I basically break down the 9 theories of those lines because most people kind of assume it means integration and disintegration. But really where I land in the new book is this is kind of an inner flow. This is a movement of restoration, of reconciliation, of resolving what's unresolved in us. And that is a perpetual path of movement. So when you can bring that into your body, even better.
That's good. I'm actually going to try this. I think Dan had his hand up. Dan, I'll let you talk your question in. Dan, are you there? All right. Well, let's go on to the other question then. What do you think about, have you seen any unique contextual conversation that's happening because of everything that's happening with COVID? How has the Enneagram served in the individuals in any way through this type of season?
Yeah. So I have a podcast called Innergram Mapmakers, and we recorded all of these episodes last fall before COVID, and the show dropped in mid-March, and I just thought, oh man, is this the worst time in the world for something like this to happen? And so actually my producer and I recorded a couple of shows where we actually align a loving kindness meditation with our Enneagram type as a way of finding some peace during this pandemic. There's another episode there where we try to find ways of holding our inner child and just letting it lament, letting it cry, letting it have a tantrum. Because the truth is like we're not getting this right, making sense of how hard things are, and that's okay, because there's no right way to do this. Like there's no sort of like success story, like you have to deal with it and suck it up and get tougher. It's like, no, actually, I think what's happening for a lot of us during this great interruption, this great pause, is things are being exposed to us that maybe we've not wanted to deal with before. And if you can, like I've said, like look at the Enneagram as a compassionate way of holding those aspects to yourself, then this is an incredible time to work on yourself, to work with these bits of who we are.
That's good. We have another question that came in from Celia, who wrote, because of my cultural background, I was raised to be a 3 and didn't realize until recently that I am actually a 7. It's been painfully healing to let go of being a dysfunctional 3, embrace my 7-ness. Do you have any advice for this transitional journey?
Man, so this is really where, first of all, I just think it's really, really unhelpful to type other people. Because coming to terms with your type has to kind of be a truth telling and an awakening to yourself. And so I did work with somebody who actually was raised as a 1. Her parents were Ennea fluent, and it turns out she was a 3. And when she realized that for herself, it was devastating to who she thought she was. Now, in this instance, I'm not clear on whether or not you were raised, let's say, with Enneagram in the holding environment, and that type was put on you, or if that was just kind of cultural or family dynamics understanding. I do think you're insightful to say this, that actually when you can read the environment of your holding environment, of your family, of your culture, and you can see affinity towards type structure, it is super freeing to say, actually, I'm not that. Like, and I don't have to be that. And I don't have to play into the expectations of what was put on me anymore. I can return to my gift and my truth. And yes, there's pain in deconstructing that. There's pain in taking the scaffolding down around that, because that scaffolding holds us and makes us feel safe. But when we can align with the best in us, it's like, I can finally breathe again. Like, oh, this hoodie isn't, I'm not wearing a medium anymore. Like I'm comfortable in this. So yeah.
I think that's good. It's so layered, right? Like living in community, whether it's a nuclear family or a group of friends, and then you have neighborhood dynamics, and then you have city dynamics, and it just goes ethnic dynamics, and there's so many different factors and pullings. And so, this journey sounds like it will definitely be a lifelong journey for sure.
And I'll say this, like I work with a lot of folks from outside the States. Like some of the folks that I've trained and studied with are Buddhists in Thailand and Sikh in India and shaman in Mexico City. And I'll say how type shows up culturally or within sort of national identity is really different. And this is again where I think you can't put type on somebody, because it's not personality. There are these compulsions and motivations within us that every layer of our culture, our ethnicity, our sexuality, our religious identity reshapes and molds. And this is where you just can't sort of say, oh, that's such a 5 thing to say, or you're acting like a 7 again. It's like, no, we're way more complicated than a number, because of all of these elements of how we've come to know ourselves. So this is great, because yes, because let me sorry, just slip this in here, because yes, most of the content that we have most successful right now is written by Western folks, largely white, largely older, largely privileged, but we're starting to see a lot of more dynamic, international, cross-cultural, non-traditional religious sort of communities working with this tool and bringing it forward. And I think And you can find some of the stuff that Astrid Chasso, this Bolivian wisdom teacher, and Claudio Naranjo, the Chilean, the salt psychoanalyst analysts work with, you'll really sort of see how they blow off, let's say, some of the Western privilege and the bias that's written into some of how this has been communicated.
We have another question here. In addition to centering prayer, what kinds of practices might you suggest for beginners to use to mind their type and what it looks like to move toward health?
Man, so that's actually the work that's my real job. Like this little nonprofit like kind of exists to introduce mindfulness meditation and contemplative practice to folks.
Yeah.
And I've tried to say this during COVID right now, like, yes, we're all locked up at home and life is turned down and things are shut. We're shut out and kept from what used to keep us busy and who we used to connect with. And so, yes, on one hand, you might think this is a perfect time to pick up a mindfulness practice. But man, I'm trying to warn some of these folks, maybe not. Like maybe if you drop into a non-conceptual meditation practice, it might drum up all of your anxiety or make you more upset or concerned or feel fearful about what's happening here. So I would say find gentle practices if you don't have a practice that maybe help you align with your breath and help you be rooted in the moment. In the Innergram of Belonging, I do 9, like I said, loving kindness meditations for each of the types. And that's just a gentle way of holding the tender part of yourself that may be suffering during the pandemic right now. But I think if centering prayer works for you, fabulous. I think if breath work works for you, fabulous. I think if guided meditations on an app work for you, fabulous. I just say start with something that feels manageable and simultaneously realize you're not going to be good at this. Like it's going to expose the anxiety and the frustration and the fear and everything that's in us. And in fact, what is exposed and what comes up is what we get to work with. And for me right now, that loving kindness meditation has been a lifesaver. So.
That's wonderful. Let me ask you 2 more questions. One is, one person writes, Whitney writes, I got 8 wing 7, and I feel as if that resonates, but sometimes I have not felt like a successful 8. Do you have any advice on the differences that can take place within those who have the same number but display it differently?
Yeah. So I'm an 8 wing 7. And I kind of joke around, like whenever I introduce Enneagram 8s at workshops or whatever, people are usually like, oh, I used to work with a really unhealthy 8. And I'm like, nope, they're probably just an 8 and you weren't standing up for yourself. So number one, all this like 8-hole energy that gets put on us, like we just have to kind of not sort of internalize that. I think the too muchness of being us when it's too much for everybody else and now we don't have permission to show up isn't, it's an unhelpful overlay that limits us from actually working on ourselves and being able to be present and feel safe in a relationship. Now I'll say this simultaneously, 8s are, you line up 9 different 8s and you're going to get 9 different kinds of people. And this is based on kind of a leaning towards that 7 or that 9 wing. But even more than that, you take these instincts, self-preservation, sexual and social, and those mix with a passion, and how one of those instincts shows up in a dominant way and mixed with your passion creates what are called subtypes. So now you have 27 subtypes. So specifically, I'm a social 8 with a 7 wing, but you can even sequence these instincts and get 54 what are called instinctual variants. And then when you throw a wing on that, that's where you get 108. So when I say specifically, I am a social, sexual, self-pres 8 with a 7 wing, that is on the 108 types exactly where I land. And I might look completely different from a social self-pres 8 with a 7 wing. And so this is where I love it. Like, it's not reductionist. You don't get backed into a corner. Like, it is dynamic. There is movement in here. And then, sorry, to make it even more complicated, and now you drop us on a 9-rung ladder of psycho-spiritual health because there's 9 ways we lie to ourselves about our basic fear. And wow, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but 9 ways that 108 people or types show up gets wild. So there's a lot to work with here. Now for most of us, 1 of 9 is enough. Like that's plenty to start with.
Well, I'm definitely glad. I know your new book also, there's a workbook comes with it. Tell us a little bit about that workbook.
Sure. So SD Zandy actually worked on my first book with my publisher, and worked together, came to actually a workshop that I did in LA, and then has just sort of stayed in conversation and sort of helped me take what I would have done in workshops with the book and the content, and then just make this available for people who want to actually kind of map their own growth. And folks are doing this on their own. Folks are using this in group settings. I think it's a great support to the book if you don't have a conversation partner, if you don't have a kind of mentor that's any affluent, and if you actually do want to do some of the work of taking something that you're reading on a page and bringing it inward. And so I was never kind of workbooky myself, and have been shocked to find out like how many people love workbooks. And so I think the workbooks are super great companions to the parent titles.
Oh, good. Well, there's another question. I thought it's a pretty fitting question to kind of close our conversation, and that is, what is something you are doing these days that bring you joy? Mm-hmm. And what are you working on next, even though your book just launched on the Innergram?
Yeah. I want to say that all the things that I'm working on bring me joy. Sometimes they don't. I don't want to be goofy. Like there's part of me that's like, dude, I like the 4 years ago version of myself would like be like, you have a dog and that dog sleeps in your bed and you sometimes share a meal with it. But I love my dog. And I swear, like Flynn and I have said this so many times, like our little dog Basil is actually helping us get through this pandemic, because clearly he doesn't know what's going on, and he actually doesn't care. I think he's actually just happy that I'm not on 110 flights this year chasing, 1K again for 15 years now. So he's helping me be present. In terms of the projects that I'm working on, I think I can announce some of these. We're about to start production for the second season of my podcast, Enneagram Mapmakers. This first season has been with my teachers, a lot of the legacy teachers of the Enneagram of personality. And the second season will be, I think, really honest and durable conversations around vocation. Mm-hmm. There's a press release that's about to drop tomorrow that's going to introduce a documentary that I've been working on for the past year called 9. And there's about 24 conversation partners. We filmed in Albuquerque and Phoenix and Los Angeles and Omaha. And, it was supposed to be in theaters this month. Of course, that's not possible. And so we're hoping for a theatrical run in September. There's another Enneagram book that I'm working on right now that hopefully will be out in March of next year. And then the biggest Enneagram project that I'm constantly working on is this soul right here that just needs to continue to sort of stumble forward and to wake up and to remember my own innocence and to be compassionate with my own inner child. And that just kind of feels like an impossible lifelong task, but one that I'm committed to.
That's really good. Well, thank you so much for everyone tuning in. Also, thank you, Chris, for spending a little bit of time. I definitely look forward to maybe a future project where you'll do the Innergram and Ideation. And so for those who are tuning in, this will be recorded and broadcast through our podcast channels in the near future. Chris also will be sure to add, any recommendations you have, books on the Innergram that you found helpful. We'll share that with this webinar group as well. But overall, thanks for doing what you're doing, and congrats on your new book. And we're really excited to see what the next steps are for you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And honestly, man, you and Tina are just incredible luminaries out there helping build a better world. So thanks for all your hard work. It's important, more important now than ever.
Thank you.